Welcome to the class on sex work and COVID-19. In this mini lecture, I'm going to give you an outline of what this lesson involves and raise some important key ideas and questions to pay attention to throughout the lesson. Before we discuss sex work, I'd like to situate this model in broader trends about sexuality and gender under COVID, particularly the COVID experiences of LGBTQ2S+ people in relation to social institutions like the family, medicine, and the legal system. LGBTQ2S+ is an acronym that stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer or questioning, and two-spirit. Let's start by considering lockdown experiences. Young adults with varying sexual and gender identities may face unique challenges under lockdown, particularly if it means moving back home with family. Home may not be a very safe place for all LGBTQ2S+ people, some of whom report rejection and hostility from parents or siblings. Spending almost 24 hours a day in this context can be re-traumatizing. As these articles document, some young people who came out at college may be forced to return home if their dorm closes. And at home, they may need to hide their identity, a phenomenon called recloseting. Recloseting can be psychologically harmful and is associated with increases in depression, anxiety, and suicidality. Recloseting is a similar phenomenon that can happen to LGBTQ elders who enter care homes where their sexual orientation or gender identity are discriminated against. The idea of recloseting is discussed in Community's report called Aging Out, Moving Toward Queer and Trans Competent Care for Seniors. Many LGBTQ2S+ people, whether youth, adults, or elders, already face challenges in their interactions with social institutions like family and healthcare, and we see COVID exacerbating these challenges in some cases. A high number of LGBTQ2S+ individuals in Canada and the United States report difficulties accessing health-related services and supplies under COVID. And we've seen this supported by substantial evidence, including this piece published by Johns Hopkins Medicine in April 2020, called "For LGBTQ Patients, the Coronavirus Brings New Challenges." Superior medical access is due partially to individuals' fear of discrimination by healthcare providers, as well as affordability barriers. In the United States, LGBTQ Americans are also less likely than the average person to have health insurance. Further, under lockdown, LGBTQ2S+ support services considered non-essential are closed or operating with restricted hours and limited staff. This includes community-based resources for mental and sexual health, such as STI and HIV testing, low-cost counseling services, mental health support groups, and walk-in health services. This lack of access to health-related services is exacerbated by the social consequences of lockdown, given that members of the LGBTQ2S+ community are already more likely to experience mental health challenges such as loneliness, depression, and anxiety, often rooted in systemic marginalization. Michael Hobbs' 2017 book, Alone Together, documents that gay people are 2 times more likely than straight people to have a major depressive episode, and, depending on the study, are between 2 and 10 times more likely to die by suicide. The article here on the right, published in 2020, reads, "LGBTQ people need queer spaces. The coronavirus has locked them out." Social distancing and lockdown protocols under COVID can increase these existing suicide risk factors documented by Hobbs. Trans people in particular are more likely to report being in fair or poor health, which makes them vulnerable to poor health outcomes. Trans people face added concern that they will be misgendered by the medical system and healthcare workers. If they do express their gender identity, they fear receiving substandard or inappropriate medical treatment, something that many respondents indicate they have experienced in the past in medical settings. The limited capacity of healthcare facilities also has unintended outcomes for trans people. As hospitals necessarily prioritize treating patients with COVID, this can result in delayed access to gender-affirming surgical care. Delayed access to gender-affirming surgeries or inadequate follow-up post-surgery, including hormonal treatment, is correlated with a greater likelihood of suicidal thoughts and attempts. In some countries, gender binaries have been reaffirmed through COVID-19 policies, with detrimental outcomes for trans people in particular. In Peru, for example, the government restricted citizen mobility based on gender in an effort to curb the spread of COVID. On certain days of the week, only men were allowed to leave the house, and on other days, only women. This law put trans people in an unclear zone and subjected them to state violence. In one incident, filmed by a bystander, 3 trans women were publicly shamed as they sought to access public services. The police officers at the scene forced these trans women to yell, quote, "I want to be a man," while bouncing and squatting in place. Other incidents included physical assault and symbolic violence rooted in transphobia. This law ended up limiting trans people's access to food, medical supplies, and other needed services. The Peruvian government did ultimately decide to retract this legislation. This legislation is an example of the harm embedded in heteronormative state policy. But what makes this policy heteronormative? Many people assume heteronormativity is about sexuality, but this Peruvian example is about gender. These trans women were discriminated against because of their gender identity. We have no idea about their sexual orientation, who they're attracted to. So let's pause and ask, what is heteronormativity? Heteronormativity is a concept that identifies the way social institutions, like the family or healthcare, and dominant culture, including narratives in popular movies, are oriented around a limited set of ideas about both gender and sexuality. Gender and sexuality are distinct social systems, but they relate to one another. Let's look at some of these ideas informing heteronormativity. Heteronormativity rests on the belief that heterosexual attraction and unions are the most normal, natural, and ideal way for sexuality, relationships, and child rearing to be organized. But what is heterosexuality exactly? And perhaps more importantly, what needs to be true in order for heterosexuality to make sense? Heterosexuality relies on the idea that there are just 2 binary genders, masculine and feminine. These genders are seen to be opposite and complementary to one another. This gender binary is also a sex binary. It relies on the idea that someone who identifies as a man will have male sex characteristics. So what are these characteristics? This would include alignment between average hormone levels, chromosomes, internal sex organs, external sex organs, and secondary sex characteristics that emerge at puberty. And the same goes for women. In a gender and sex binary society, someone who identifies as a woman will have female sex characteristics. In other words, they will be cisgender. A cis person experiences their gender to match the sex they were assigned at birth. This sex and gender binary has become important at certain points in history, as reproduction and child rearing were sanctioned solely within the institution of marriage. And who had access to marriage? People who presented as heterosexual. So, if we go back to our example of gender-based lockdown policies in Peru, we can see that this COVID policy is based on a number of cisnormative assumptions about gender, that are actually tied to heteronormative beliefs about both gender and sexuality. I've been asked whether it is heteronormativity or homophobia or transphobia playing out in this lockdown case. To answer that, let's first go back to our care facility example. The subheading of this article reads, quote, "Gay seniors say they face a hard choice, hide who they are or deal with discriminatory backlash." We need to identify the source of this discrimination in order to assess whether it is heteronormativity or homophobia and transphobia at play here. We often understand homophobia as a fear of or discomfort with homosexuality and people who identify as gay or lesbian, and transphobia as a fear of trans peoples. In other words, we see homophobia and transphobia as an individual trait. Some individuals are homophobic or transphobic, and some individuals are not. Often we think that homophobia is the result of a lack of knowledge. For instance, if you knew gay people, you wouldn't be homophobic. That is one of the assumptions. If we take this phobia lens, then we would ask whether care workers, medical staff, and other elders at the care facility harbor homophobic or transphobic attitudes, and as a result, treat LGBTQ2S+ seniors differently than other seniors. The solution here would typically be anti-homophobia and anti-transphobia education and training. This training can address these fears at the individual level. But even after this training, heteronormativity can remain intact at the care facility. How can this be the case? Think back to our definition of heteronormativity. Heteronormativity refers to the way social institutions and dominant culture are oriented around a limited set of ideas about both gender and sexuality. So heteronormativity is not just about individual attitudes. It operates instead at the institutional level through policies and procedures. So let's think institutionally about this care facility. What might we want to examine? Does the care facility have a strict policy about who counts as family, who can visit at certain hours, who can access the elder's medical information? This could be detrimental in a country without same-sex marriage where life partners are denied this access and rights. Another question, are sleeping arrangements organized by gender? Are washrooms accessible to elders of all genders? Do medical forms have spaces for preferred names and preferred pronouns? So now I'll ask you, is this COVID case an example of heteronormativity, transphobia, or both? The answer is that it depends on what unit of analysis you are looking at. If you're looking at the state policy of gender-based lockdown, this is an institutional level decision that is heteronormative. If you are looking at the behavior of these individual police, this may be more of an individual level prejudice that led them to act in discriminatory ways toward the people they are meant to serve. So we might describe these individual officers as transphobic. At the same time, though, if these transphobic beliefs and actions are widespread among the police and other government workers and social servants, then it would lead us back to broader institutional questions about organizational culture, policies, and training. Let's return to the broader question of LGBTQ2S experiences under COVID. Research also shows that there are economic dimensions of COVID specifically for the queer community. In fact, LGBTQ2S+ people are at greater risk of negative financial impacts under this pandemic. The Human Rights Campaign recently found that queer Americans are more likely to work in industries highly affected by COVID, which brings more risk of virus transmission as well as loss of earnings. Queer Americans are much more likely than the general population to have lost their job or had their wages reduced in COVID times. Some of these economic impacts may be reduced by long overdue legislation passed during the pandemic in the US. In June 2020, the US Supreme Court ruled that federal law prohibits discrimination against gay and transgender people in the workplace. The decision reads, quote, "An employer who fires an individual for being homosexual or transgender fires that person for traits or actions it would not have questioned in members of a different sex." Sex plays a necessary and undisguisable role in the decision, exactly what Title VII forbids, unquote. The use of the word sex here is interesting. Here we see the tight connection between heteronormative systems of sex, gender, and sexuality coming into play in order to make this decision. COVID-related resources are also being created for LGBTQ+ people, including new or modified support services for mental health and housing options for young people in unsafe homes. Later in this course, we will also touch on other COVID-informed gender and sexuality issues, including the way that lockdown has exacerbated gender-based sexual violence, experiences of dating under physical distancing protocols, and how experiences of lockdown can play out in gendered ways, especially for people with children. But the main focus of this class, which I will now introduce, is sex work under COVID-19. How are workers in the sex industry affected by COVID? The commentary here on the right by MP Hetty Fry, published in the Georgia Straight in May 2020, reads, quote, "We have seen the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on marginalized communities, as the Government of Canada rolled out emergency supports for individuals, small and medium-sized businesses, students, seniors, arts, culture, sports, and nonprofit sectors. It became evident that there were some groups that went underserved and unnoticed. One of the groups with no income, no access to resources, precariously housed, and food insecure, and who may be forced at this time of pandemic to work in risky situations in order to survive, are workers in the sex trade." The article continues, "Most sex workers are not eligible for Canada's emergency response benefits, for Canada's emergency wage subsidy, for grants, or for rent assistance. They face evictions, food insecurity, and poor access to public health services. They have families to feed, and despite fears for their health and physical safety, they are pushed even further to the margins in order to survive." In this class, we'll consider how relief funds are accessible or not to workers in the sex industry under the pandemic. We also ask how this access to emergency funds is informed by Canadian legislation around sex work, and then we'll look at this in cross-national comparative perspective. We'll examine a case study of sex worker legislation and COVID emergency funds access in New Zealand. This was featured in The Guardian's COVID coverage in April 2020 and serves as the reading for this class. We'll think about how different forms of sex work are impacted by the pandemic, lockdown, and physical distancing. Experts note in particular that as sex workers have reduced incomes and little government support under COVID, they become more vulnerable to exploitation. And we'll consider existing inequalities between sex workers and how these inequities are exacerbated under COVID. This article, titled "How Sex Workers Are Keeping Clients in Line in a Pandemic," shows how some clients are pressuring sex workers to continue face-to-face services, and sometimes even without protections. The article features real text messages exchanged between workers and clients. Although I suspect the one shown here on the title page is a bit of a joke. We see a client asking for a face-to-face session, worker responding, "Sure, babe, I'll wear my new outfit for you. Want to see?" And then the worker sends a picture of a full-body hazmat suit. Pretty sexy. We're going to ask whether all sex workers have this much flexibility to choose whether and how to see clients. And we'll consider what factors increase and decrease sex worker autonomy and choice under the pandemic. We'll finish this class by looking at the ways workers in the sex industry have adapted and innovated to support themselves financially in times of physical distancing and lockdown. And we'll look at the dramatic shift to online sex work, weighing both the benefits and limitations of this trend. Our guest lecturer for this class is Dr. Becky Ross, UBC professor in sociology and the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice. Professor Ross is also a faculty associate of the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies. Dr. Ross's research interrogates themes of sexual and gender identity, racial and ethnic diversity, community formation, space and place, and state regulation. In particular, Professor Ross probes discourses and practices of identities, families, communities, and the nation in the context of legacies of colonial rule, medicalization, stigmatization, and criminalization. I feature here one of Dr. Ross's books, Burlesque West: Showgirls, Sex and Sin in Post-War Vancouver. In 2008, Professor Ross co-founded Vancouver's West End Sex Work Memorial Project, and in 2019, she won the Angus Reid Practitioners Applied Sociology Award with her late collaborator, Jamie Lee Hamilton. To conclude this mini lecture, I'll leave you with some underlying questions to consider as you engage with this class.